Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to our talk on instructional design tips for the real world. We are honored to have two special guests with us tonight. One is Dr. John Hoffman, as well as Collin College's own Ms. Natalie Greenwell. I'd like to start by introducing Ms. Greenwell, who in turn will introduce our special guest this evening. Ms. Greenwell procures workforce training delivering highly customized courses to employees at their place of business. CWED deploys $500,000 in grant funding annually. She works with government, business, and industry in Collin and Rockwell counties. Ms. Greenwell is a graduate of Texas Tech University and formerly worked at Lubbock and Corpus Christi ISD. She's formerly the Continuing Education Program Director at Dallas County Community College District. She is married with two extraordinary, almost adult children. Ms. Natalie Greenwell, thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I want to welcome all of you to the campus. I know you've been coming, and I didn't know you were coming at this time of day on Friday. So congratulations to all of you for your forward to coming in on the weekend already. We do have a very special guest, and I will try to go through all of this, and I can take questions afterwards. I'm going to see who I was listening, because it's quite lengthy. We're very excited. Dr. John Hoffman is our special guest. He graduated from Brigham Young University. I forgot to put him in. And with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a PhD in instructional design. So that's why he's here, not for the psychology, okay? He does know and can answer to y'all because he spent some time down in Austin. He worked for IBM after graduation there, and was immediately pulled in for his talents into the doing research on the usability of publications. And from there, he moved on to the Human Factors group. He helped design a large new human factors testing facility and conducted numerous tests on IBM software. He authored the idea of walk-up and use interface design and taught a class on human-computer interface design to programmers at IBM. I'm sure that's no small feat. He also served for a year as a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin, and then after that transferred to the IBM Education and Training Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he worked for the next 18 years as an instructional designer and learning consultant on projects for both IBM and other companies. Some of his designs include a cue card authoring tool. I'm hoping y'all know what this is, because I don't. So a major electronic performance support system for Dow Chemical, a 3-week course teaching IBM service engineers how to diagnose problems using IBM supercomputers, an object-oriented programming course, numerous sales courses, and a variety of other training courses and materials for delivery in classroom and in technology-based situations. Mr. Hoffman, or Dr. Hoffman, I'm so sorry, also designed, wrote, and developed a 13-hour web-based training course for IBM on instructional design and development. And after 31 years at IBM, Dr. Hoffman left there and joined eFolder as Director of Education and Training, where he's worked for the last 5 years. He's written 2 books on instructional design, and I believe you're going to get a little slide with copies of those so that you can put them on your home library. And I'm sure he'll show you where he lives in wonderful Orem, Utah. He went back to Utah, did not stay in the South, where he does extensive hiking and mountaineering, and in the summertime, skis with his grandkids. So I give that to you, Dr. John Hoffman.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much. Thank you. Very
good. Thank you for that kind introduction, Natalie. I'm very happy to be here tonight. It's very exciting for me to get to present to instructional design students. You're such a specialized audience and have such specialized academic interests that it's very rare that I get to talk to my fellow instructional designers or those who need to acquire instructional design skills. So thank you for attending this presentation tonight. I hope I'm able to add to your repertoire and insights and add value to your training and education. So what I put together tonight is a presentation on what I would like to tell instructional design students who are about to go out into the real world about instructional design some of the things I would emphasize and want to share with them from my 36 years of experience in doing instructional design out in the real world. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Our agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to cover 9 instructional design tips. And if you would hold your questions while I cover those, since we have such limited time here, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. So let's go ahead and jump in. Before we start with the first tip, though, I would like to emphasize that in my mind, instructional design centers around analysis. The core skill in instructional design is analysis. The design follows the analysis, but without the analysis, you wouldn't have good design. So the foundation of it all is analysis. When I say analysis, I mean there's several different analytical tools that we use as instructional designers, including performance analysis, goal analysis, performance analysis, task analysis, content analysis, and others. So that collection of skills taken together, to me, it comprises what we do in analysis. So in the final analysis, no pun intended there, good instructional designers are valued for their analytical skills more than their artistic, verbal, or graphical skills. It's great to have those additional skills, and they add greatly to your repertoire and competence as an instructional designer. But without that analytical skill, your value just wouldn't be there. Educationally sound instruction is best achieved when analysis precedes design and development, and when the design is based on the analysis. So the front-end analysis really does lay the foundation of good design. Instructional designers, to me, are most like engineers, not artists. You know, it's not a wing-it kind of profession. If you wanted to, would you cross over a new bridge over a large river such as the Mississippi, for which the engineer had not conducted an engineering analysis to be sure the design was sound? Or would you want to be the first one to ride an elevator in which the engineer had not conducted any engineering analysis? You probably wouldn't want to. And the same thing applies to creating good, sound training in education. Without that analysis, it's very questionable as to whether you achieve lean, efficient, and motivational instruction. And without the analysis, one person's opinion about what should be included in the course or taught in the course is as good as another's. So if you were to get together with your subject matter experts or your sponsors, everybody would be chipping in their 2 cents as to what should be in the course. And you really wouldn't have a very good way of evaluating whether their suggestions should be taken up or not without that analysis. Now, instructional developers, as opposed to instructional designers, are the ones that actually flesh out the course. They're like the construction tradespeople in creating a building. They flesh out or build the content of the course based on the blueprints that were created by the architect and the engineer. So that's how I kind of view instructional designers versus instructional developers, with the emphasis being instructional design is an analytical profession, and without that analysis, I would have been in very bad shape as far as creating good training throughout my career. So let's start in with tip number 1, which the previous slide leads directly into, which is don't skip the front-end analysis. Sponsors of training who request training and meet with you saying, hey, we've got to have this course by tomorrow, or we have this problem out there we need to solve with training. They often want you to hear their request and then immediately jump in and start developing slides or developing content. And they don't understand the need to do any kind of front-end analysis. So in many cases, you have to educate them somewhat as to the importance of doing that and slow them down a little bit and help them understand the need to spend the time to conduct this analysis, usually with the subject matter expert. So don't succumb to this temptation to just jump in and immediately start creating course materials. Of course, to be sure of hitting the target, if you shoot first and then whatever you hit, you call the target, then you'll always hit the target. But that target may not be the one that is going to help that business organization further their goals. It may not be on target as far as what they need. So, and the other thing to realize is there's often a lot of schedule pressures that add to the urgency to skip this front-end analysis. So you're going to be up against that immediately when you come up against these requests. People just think that as soon as you hear the request, you can get together with a subject matter expert and you've got it all wrapped up. You'll start creating the course right then and there. So during this front-end analysis, be sure that you identify what the target is. So to do that, you'll need to ask questions until you understand what the business problem is that needs to be solved. Are there gaps in performance? Is there a new performance that has never been done before that needs to be trained to? What is the business problem? And understand why training will solve this problem. We'll see on the next slide that performance problems can be caused by many other deficiencies other than training. You need to know who the audience is, and one reason you know that, of course, is to know what skills they already bring to the table when you start your training course, what entry-level knowledge and skills that they have. But you also need to know what their motivations are, what their job environment is, and many other things about them, so that you have an overall general understanding of who they are, what makes them tick, and what they want to accomplish. You also need to know the job outcomes that students will be expected to produce back on the job. Now, this is for performance-based training, of course. If you're teaching only knowledge, if it's just a knowledge-based outcome, then you'll need to perform content analysis to analyze that content and break it down into its constituent parts to understand what needs to be taught in the course. But for performance-based training, you need to identify what the outcomes are, what the accomplishments that students will need to produce back in the job that you will need to help them be able to produce. So performance gaps may not be due to a lack of training. There's many other reasons for performance gaps. The grandfather of human performance improvement is Thomas F. Gilbert, and he lived many years ago, but wrote this book called Human Competence, Engineering Worthy Performance. And he talks in there why what we're really after is helping people produce accomplishments. And these accomplishments, not capabilities, are the things that organizations and businesses are willing to pay us to help people produce. In the area of human performance improvement, look through this list of why people may not be performing. They may not have clear expectations that they need to perform. They may not have the resources they need to perform. Maybe they don't have any feedback so that the quality of their performance is not visible to them. Perhaps the performance is punishing in some way or not rewarding. Or maybe they did it way a long time ago but had forgotten how to do it. Or there might be obstacles in the way of performance that need to be removed. So if those are the cases, or if any one of those is the case, would training solve that issue? Probably not. And even if it did, would it be the most cost-effective solution to doing so? If all they need is a job aid to help them perform, and you send them to a week-long training course, well, that's not very efficient. And one of the best analytical processes for analyzing performance problems has been documented by Robert Mager and Peter Pipe in their book, Analyzing Performance Problems. It's really a book that every instructional designer should have in their library and should have read. This algorithm that you can go through to analyze performance problems is excellent. And so I'd highly recommend that as further reading to acquire that skill. Now, what if people come to you with fuzzy requests for training? For example, employees need to be more customer oriented, or they need to know how to use this application, or our salespeople need to be motivated to embrace our new methodology. Those are pretty broad, fuzzy goals. And you may not know from that exactly what the target is that needs to be embraced to produce the right outcomes. We don't know what they really want. One of my people who works for me just related this week how the sponsor told her that they wanted one thing for training, and she went off and produced that, and the subject matter expert came back and said, no, it needs to be, the audience is wrong. We're writing this for technical people, not for management people. And so there was confusion there, and she had to go back and redo the course and redesign it because it had been designed for the wrong audience. So make sure that the goals get clarified and agreed upon up front. Goal Analysis is another book written by Robert Mager, and it goes in and gives you skills, teaches you skills on how to break down broad, fuzzy goals. And basically what you're going to be doing in there is asking people, how would you know one when I see one? In other words, how would I know someone who's doing this or has accomplished this when I see it? Is there a single class of behavior or a single behavior or class of behaviors that will indicate the presence of the alleged performance about which there would be general agreement? Now that statement there is pretty fuzzy, but it's explained in detail in the book, so I'll leave it for the book to get more into that. Tip number 2 is to start with the outcomes or accomplishments and analyze backwards. In other words, as part of that front-end analysis, you're going to be identifying what are the outcomes that students are going to have to produce back on the job that we are going to train to. So we're going to identify those outcomes, and then we're going to break them down. We're going to work backwards. We're going to start with the outcome and say, well, what is required to produce this outcome? And usually that breaks down into major activities, and then those major activities are broken into sub-activities, which are further broken into tasks and subtasks, and finally down to the step-by-step level. And that usually breaks out into some kind of hierarchical analysis. So these outcomes are outputs or the results of behavior. They're not the behaviors that produce the outputs. So as opposed to instructional objectives, which always have a verb as part of it, outcomes are nouns or noun phrases. They don't describe general skills that we're trying to teach students. They describe the accomplishments that they're going to produce, either tangible or intangible, back on the job. And that's where we start with our analysis. Here's some of the characteristics of outcomes. Examples of a noun job outcome, one that can be stated as a noun, are things like contracts, reports, presentations, produce a widget, for example, sales, profits, solution, decision. And that last one is a material safety data sheet, which is the outcome that I had to create an electronic performance support system for Dow Chemical back on a project which took 2 years up in Canada, where I helped create a cue card system that would start at the very beginning of that and lead every department, every chemist that needed input into it, lead them through the proper steps until they produced this legal document that was very complex and very lengthy. Had a lot of people producing or contributing to that outcome. So outcomes aren't necessarily always tangible. A widget is a tangible outcome, produce this widget, but a solution can also be an outcome. It's intangible, or a decision is intangible. So outcomes are not necessarily tangible, always tangible outcomes. And outcomes can also be described as noun phrases. For example, a painted house, or an accessible web page, or a running network after a crash. Findings from the analysis, widget after quality check, and so forth. Outcomes can be normal, off-normal, or emergency. You can imagine the need to cover emergency outcomes for a nuclear power plant, where suddenly things go awry, and what do you do? If you don't know how to do the right thing there can be some severe consequences. Standards of performance are often incorporated into these outcomes as well, so that you have a way of evaluating whether the outcome meets the proper standards. And outcomes are then analyzed, as I mentioned, into sub-outcomes, activities, tasks, subtasks, and finally down to the step-by-step level. This hierarchical breakdown, along with the content analysis that's performed on this hierarchy, is used to structure the course. Now, there's a lot of technique and instructional design behind these statements, and I won't try to get into them because they're all described, in my book on instructional design, and it's really can't do justice to them in a couple of sentences. So I'll leave it to my book to help you through that. Now, why don't we start the analysis with identifying instructional objectives? Now, this was kind of a shock to me because when I went through my training at the university, we did a needs assessment, and then we identified our instructional objectives, and we designed the training from there. So it was kind of a foreign concept to me to think of not writing any objectives until you had completed this elaborate front-end analysis and outcome analysis and content analysis. And you also, based on those analysis, you structure the course before you determine what the formal objectives are. So that was a new concept for me, and I got exposed to it, I think, in one of Joe Harless's courses as a benefit. When I worked at IBM, at least for the first decade or so, they sponsored employees taking out-of-company training courses if they applied to their field and enhanced their skills. So I took advantage of that as much as I could, and took courses from a lot of the grandfathers in human performance in our field, such as Bob Mager and Joe Harless, Robert Horn, and others. And many of these things I learned from them, from their years of experience, and I think this was one of them with Joe Harless in his course. This was a 3-week-long course on instructional design. The first week was spent on front-end analysis. I don't know if you can read that title of this binder here. I've got 3 of these big, thick bindings, but this says front-end analysis. So we spent a whole week on nothing more than just different analysis that goes into the whole front-end analysis. That's how important it is to do that analysis work. And we do it before we write any instructional objectives. Now, once we've done the analysis and both the outcome analysis down to the level of tasks and steps, and then we go through that and identify the content that's required for students to be able to perform those steps, that's the content analysis, then we're ready to structure the course based on that hierarchy. And in my book, I show you examples of how to do that. After you've structured the course into modules and topics or units or whatever, then you can write the formal objectives for each of those topics or units. And they fall out almost automatically at that point in time. It's a very mechanical, almost a mechanical process to write the instructional objectives at that point, because you know every procedure that has to be taught and every piece of content that has to be taught along the way in order to perform that procedure. So with those two pieces of knowledge, it becomes very easy to write the objectives. So job outcomes versus objectives. Job outcomes describe tangible work products and intangible work results, not the skills, knowledge, or attitudes that are required to produce them, which is typically the level at which instructional objectives are written. Instructional objectives, as I mentioned, always include a behavior or a verb describing what the student's going to do, how they're going to behave to do something, whereas outcomes do not. Why focus on job outcomes? Well, these are the things that have value to the organization or the business. That's what justifies the cost and investment in the training, not on helping students have general skills, knowledge, or competencies that some group thinks they ought to know. It's their actual ability to produce those outcomes that has value to the organization. And that's a big insight. That's a big reason we focus on those outcomes. So we start with the outcomes and we work backwards, meaning we analyze them, we break them down into their constituent parts. And once we've done that, then we work forward and create a structure for the design, and we flesh out the development for that design. Now, in almost all analysis activities, I use the outline facility of a word processor such as Microsoft Word. I find it's just an invaluable tool to do this. You can indent the levels of as you go down the hierarchy. It's automatically indented, and then you can collapse whole levels of the hierarchy so that you can focus on higher levels or expand a lower level and focus in on that. It really is a very, very valuable tool, and I just would be handicapped without it. I almost can't think about doing design without using a word processor in outline mode. You can modify things, you can move things up and down the hierarchy without having to retype them. There's just a whole slew of things you can do. And I discuss that in my book as well, and give you an example of how that's done. Tip number 3, what is good instruction? Well, that can be evaluated after the fact, and that's what Kirkpatrick's model is all about over here on the right side in that little diagram that you can't read probably. You know, he has different levels of evaluating instruction, starting with the results, the behavior, the learning, and the reaction, or starting, I'm sorry, with the reaction, and then evaluating what they learned, seeing if they could transfer the behavior back to the job, and ultimately did they produce the results that we expected with the training. And that's all good. You know, if you can get your sponsor to agree to let you do that, that's fantastic. That'll give you a lot of good feedback about the course and where it needs improvement. But there's another way to evaluate instruction even before it gets out the door. If you have access to the instructional design and the analysis work that went into it. And I would evaluate it on 3 different criteria. One, is it lean? Meaning, does it only include information that's absolutely essential to producing the outcomes and nothing more? It doesn't have extraneous information in there, or nice to know information, or related information. It only has the information that's absolutely needed to produce those outcomes. And it has all the required enabling content that is needed as well. So is it effective? It includes all of the required information for producing the outcomes. Now, believe it or not, I've seen so many courses where they leave out essential pieces for producing outcomes. And it's not all obvious to the course creators. I think they get in there and wade through so much content that they're kind of overwhelmed and can't see the forest for the trees sometimes. But sometimes content that's required is left out. So if it's effective, nothing is left out. It has all the required content in there. And to do that, you have to perform that instructional analysis, and you have to drill it down to the level of the student's entry-level skills and knowledge, so you can start where they're at and not make assumptions about what they already know or can do. And then to be effective, the knowledge should be taught according to what type of information it is. Is it a concept? Is it a process, a procedure, classification? There are instructional strategies that are optimized for teaching each type of information. So to be effective, a concept should be taught in a certain way, using certain strategies. And then the third area is motivational. Is the instruction motivational? It will be if you went through the front-end analysis and identified what students will have to produce back on the job, and then you design the instruction around that. When you do that, it becomes very obvious to students when they look at the table of contents or the outline of the training. They'll see immediately the relevance of the training, because they'll see in there the high-level tasks that they're going to have to be performing back on the job. So the training is going to be motivational, because it's the very essence of what they need to acquire those skills and produce those outcomes. So if you forget those three things, it's incorporated into the title of my book, Instructional Design Step by Step, 9 Easy Steps for Designing Lean, Effective, and Motivational Instruction. Pretty instruction does not equate with good instruction, necessarily equate with good instruction. Appearances can be deceiving. I've seen a lot of really bells and whistles, sexy courses that have lots of elements to them, lots of interaction, lots of graphics, maybe even some sound or audio and all kinds of things. But if they're not designed well, and the instruction is poor, it frustrates students and they don't learn the skills. I'd much rather have ugly, bare bones, well-designed instruction than this sexy, poor instruction with all the bells and whistles. So, and I think students are with me there too. It's easy for sponsors to be duped into thinking that the instruction's good because it looks good. And that's the only clue they have as to whether it's good or not. Hey, it looks really fancy. It looks like a Cadillac, you know, it's got everything. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good instruction. What does good instruction feel like? Learning feels almost effortless. Things are so clear that they seem obvious. You understand things immediately when they're taught. The sequence and flow of the material seem perfectly logical. Navigation is intuitive, easy to understand. Prerequisite knowledge is refreshed when it's needed. And graphics and other media are used appropriately to help teach the information. You're also given the opportunity to practice what you're being taught. So practice is frequent, and it starts with simple practice and builds up to more difficult and integrated practice exercises. Thirdly, training feels like it was tailored specifically to meet your needs. The material is right on target for what you were expecting, and the training is lean. No irrelevant material is included. And the training will be motivational and enjoyable to take. It's engaging, it's pleasant, and it's interactive. Tip number 4, cognitive learning models should include practice with feedback. I'm sure you've been exposed to a basic cognitive learning model. The first 4 parts of that are gain attention, sensory perception, higher level cognition, and memory storage and retrieval. But I would like to amend that and add a 5th element to that model, which is practice with feedback. In other words, it's not enough just to be exposed to something and store it in memory. You need to be able to apply it and practice it for it to be reinforced and for you to build the confidence that you can produce those outcomes. So another thing that happens when you practice is you clarify and solidify conceptual boundaries. You build confidence, and you have an experiential base to your learning, all of which improve learning. So practice is very important, and it typically gets left out of a lot of training just because the budget is not there to support it. But just be aware that if it is sacrificed, be aware of the consequences and what you'll be sacrificing. Tip number 5, learning is biological, not just cognitive. Now, this was something that took me a while to really understand or think through or be aware of, because I always thought of learning as being just an intellectual activity. It's just something that we do with our minds. It has no biological component to it. But that's not true. Learning occurs when new neural interconnections are formed in the brain that can later be accessed. And it takes time for those natural biological processes to establish, I call it to grow these new neural interconnections, but to establish them in your brain. That's a biological process. So your job as an instructional designer, one way of looking at it, is to grow new neural interconnections in the brains of your students, and to do so in the most efficient and time-effective